People very often ask me both how and why I started my podcasting journey. Well, as an engineer, I'm frankly very passionate about math. I wanted to find somewhere to share stories of great mathematicians from Archimedes to Alan Turing and everyone in between. And for that reason, I want to tell you a little bit about my preferred hosting platform, which is Zencaster. Now, before I continue, this is usually the conversation I have with anybody who is wanting to start their own podcast. I know there are so many people out there with passions that they want to share with the world or unique knowledge that they're just looking for a platform to start with. And Zencaster is a wonderful all-in-one platform. What I mean by that is you can do your recording and your editing and use AI to create a transcript and distribute to all platforms, including Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else where podcasts are played. For anybody like me who might worry at first about what you might sound like on an audio recording, Zencaster's post-production process makes you sound really, really smooth. It automatically removes any of the ums or ahs in your recording. It removes any of the awkward pauses in conversations, and it also helps you to set the right podcast loudness and levels while reducing any background noise, all with the click of a button. It couldn't be easier. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code BREAKINGMATH, and you'll get 30% off your first month in any Zencaster paid plan. I want you to have the same easy experience I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. Fairly often, I get asked questions about how I got started podcasting with the Breaking Math podcast, and I'll often be asked this question by those who are thinking of starting their own podcast. That is, people who are looking to tell a story or share their unique wisdom with a larger audience or their passions, or maybe just advertise their business or services. I usually like to start this conversation by either showing off or telling about our preferred podcasting platform, Zencaster. Zencaster is essentially an all-in-one podcast hosting platform. On this platform, you can do everything from recording your episodes to editing your audio and video files to distributing your podcast to all podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever else podcasts are played. Now, there's more. When I first began podcasting, I used to get very nervous about how I would sound. I would sometimes stutter or have awkward pauses or other audio blemishes in my recordings. Now, Zencaster has a new suite of AI tools in their post-production process that make you sound really smooth. They automatically take out any of the ums or ahs in your recording. Also, they automatically take out any of the awkward pauses in your discussions. The tools will also help you set the right loudness and balance all the levels while reducing any background noise, all with the click of a button. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? You really should check it out. Really, the world needs to hear what you have to say. In fact, I'm going to give you a code below to help give you a large discount. It's all one word, Breaking Math. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code BREAKINGMATH, and you'll get 30% off of your first month in any Zencaster paid plan. I want you to have the same easy experience I do for all my podcasting content needs. It's time to share your...
What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to make a mistake? These are questions which we are not going to attempt to answer, but they are essential to the study of today's episode. Consciousness. Consciousness is the nebulous thing that lends a certain air of importance to experience. But as we've seen from 500 centuries of fascination with this topic, it is difficult to describe in languages which we're used to. But with the advent of neuroscience and psychology, we seem to be closer than ever to revealing aspects of consciousness that we've never beheld. So what does it mean to feel? What are qualia? And how do we know that we ourselves are conscious? All of this and more on this episode of Breaking Math. Episode 15, Consciousness, Part 1. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Gabriel.
And today we're covering something kind of far away, it seems like at first, from math, consciousness.
Yeah, this topic has been studied. Actually, this has been talked about, for centuries and centuries. And this may be thought of as a more philosophical problem. However, it is our belief that everything in the universe can be described mathematically. Now, how we go about describing consciousness mathematically, I think it may be more correct to say we describe elements of consciousness mathematically, and then how those elements are brought together, well, we believe is open for discussion. discussion, and we won't have answers to all of the parts of that question, but it's a very noble task, we believe.
As far as we could tell, there is no answer to what some people call the hard problem of consciousness, which we won't really touch on until we do a sequel to this episode.
That's right. We have multiple episodes planned when we're going to talk about both consciousness as well as mathematical models of human consciousness. And you're right. You can do any kind of literature search on the hard problem of consciousness, describing what is it that causes us to, feel alive, feel what it means to be a living human being who is self-aware as well as aware of one's surroundings. But nonetheless, we will still be discussing a lot about what makes up consciousness.
And just like philosophy is kind of a component of math, I'm sure some of the philosophers will get mad at me for saying that, but what I mean is that math is made itself out of philosophy. So is consciousness made out of different aspects of math, and these are aspects which we've covered on the show so far, actually.
That's fascinating. I love the idea. And again, I'm gonna agree with you I'm gonna agree with your statement earlier that there are some philosophers who will say no, philosophy did not come from math. Rather, mathematics is the empirical branch of philosophy. But that's nor here nor there. The idea that everything is mathematics and that everything that we see is emergent from math, even consciousness, is a quite profound idea, and I love that idea. Now, as Jonathan was alluding to earlier, here on the Breaking Math podcast, for a very long time, we have been talking about a very broad range of topics, all different things that involve math, including mathematics and elitism. What are some of the other topics, Jonathan?
We've done information theory,
yes,
chaos, computation, algorithms. What else have we done?
Oh gosh, we've done physics, language. We've done the mathematics of human language. We've done neural networks, and various parts of other episodes have all led up to this point. And what comes after will only benefit from it.
So we're going to go a little bit into each thing that we've talked about on the podcast, what it has to do with consciousness, and move on. So I think we're going to start with information theory.
Yes, if we recall, for those of you who have listened to our episodes in sequence, the third episode of Breaking Math was called Too Much Information, and it was all about Shannon's information theory, which is an extremely important topic in electrical engineering and basically in the digital age, which has been essentially over the last 100 years. So what are some of the more important points in the information theory episode?
I think one of the main points is that everything really is made out of information. I mean, physics can be said to, that's a little bit more controversial, but for example, language, you have a certain amount of bits per word, a bit being a yes or no decision. So for example, most words contain like maybe 2 or 3 bits of information, meaning that if I'm going to say a random word, it takes 2 or 3 guesses if I only tell you yes or no what that word is going to be, if you knew the words that came before and you knew the language that I'm speaking. And actually we do sort of see parts of bits, when we're talking about how much information there is in a word, for example, on average there are parts of bits. So just like that indivisible thing, there are ways of dividing it that are unintuitive. And I would suggest, especially for this episode, what do you think? This is one of the most important ones to go back to?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. I would say that in our discussion of consciousness, I think the crux of it, or one of the cruxes, essentially is understanding information theory and understanding how information can be represented as a bit, or as Jonathan said, on average, even a fraction of a bit.
Also, we're going to talk about a little bit of physics. Mostly our discussion of physics is going to be limited to the nervous system, which we did talk about in a recent episode 14 actually, because the nervous system is designed to predict physical phenomena.
One of the other episodes we have, or arguably a couple of our episodes, are about the hardware aspect of computation. Episode 4, which came right after Too Much Information, is called Digital Evolution. And of course, that was all about the evolution of computing hardware. Now, all of our senses, which contribute, which give information to our brain, which then processes and we experience consciousness as a form of the processing of information, all of our senses are, in a sense, computation hardware. We've got our eyes, our ears, our sense of touch, smell, and taste. All of those are hardware that take in information. So that was a very, very relevant episode, and we can certainly use the aspects of that episode when we're talking about the brain and the nervous system and how information is taken in.
And we're going to talk a little bit about the software aspect of the brain, which is pretty much the most we're going to go into. That is about illusion and how illusion exists in every single sensory input.
Right. We had a few episodes that touched on software. Obviously, as you said earlier, our last episode on neural networks. What are some of the other episodes?
The hacking culture one.
Yes, culture of hacking, which absolutely, you can hack your brain, as you said, where you've got an optical illusion. But also, we had an episode on the on evolutionary algorithms. We may go into that a little bit as well.
And as we said, we're not going to be focusing on the hard problem of human consciousness. So, we will touch a little bit on what it means later, but for right now, we're going to be talking about the building blocks of consciousness, which are far more varied and complex than you might think. At first, this was not going to be a whole episode. It started out as like an introduction, didn't it?
I think so. This emerged from some discussions on a lot of things, which kind of evolved into what we have now.
So without further ado, consciousness.
On consciousness, part 1, we will be focusing on the senses and how the senses take in information. What will we be discussing on this episode in particular?
We'll be discussing the mathematical representation of various senses. That's to say, how you could represent them mathematically and manipulate them from that. What is a sense? Because that is something that is not as well defined as you might think. We can blame Aristotle once again. The information content of various senses, including light, and even the information content of consciousness itself.
Right. Now, we very frequently bring up information, and in fact, there's actually one other element that I want to bring up if this is a good time. And the other element is dimensionality. This is something that we've touched on a little bit. We had a mini-sode where we talked about a hypercube with more than 3 dimensions. But how does dimensionality relate to information theory and the senses?
Each sense has a different amount of dimensions. For example, the sense of a sight. You have these 3-dimensional samples that are all arranged. It's kind of like a 3-dimensional like hyperplane going through 6-dimensional space. You have hearing, which is just a 2-dimensional sheet that's being pulled through time. You have touch, which is very much like sight, because you have heat, you have the sense of pressure, you have the sense of like an edge, you have all these different things.
So when we use that word dimension, and when we say that a sense is multi-dimensional, is it almost like saying it is a category of information? Like you had said sight earlier, I think, and you said that sight has three dimensions. So I know that we have a spectrum, a given spectrum, and I think that we've got cones, which are receptors in our eyes, and they are there's 3 categories of cones, and they each have their own spectrum. Is that right? So essentially, a dimension is very much a category. Is that right?
Yes, and it's more than a category. It's a degree of freedom. Okay. Because there's also the up down is one dimension, left right is another dimension, and time is a third dimension. So that's kind of what the 3-dimensional sheet is. Mm-hmm. And then when you add in the red, green, and blue, and that's how we know is actually that we have 3 extra dimensions for the samples themselves, is because we can make any color or pretend to make any color. We'll go into this using just combinations of red, green, and blue light.
Okay, fascinating. That makes a lot of sense, especially when you say that, on one hand, it's we'll say a category, or rather, a red cone or a green cone or a blue cone. Did I say that right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And on the other hand, you also have, the sense of up and down, or, left and right. So that's what we mean when we talk about dimensions. And of course, all of our senses are multi-dimensional, some more than others.
And some have partial dimensions, but we'll get into that in just a little bit.
The first sense that we will be discussing is the sense of sight. There is a lot that we have learned about sight in recent years. For human beings, we are able to see frequencies with wavelengths between approximately 400 and 700 nanometers. The eye has two types of cells, cone cells and rod cells. Rod cells have a peak sensitivity of 498 nanometers, or a bluish green. The sense of sight is a very thorough sense indeed. There are some 125 million sensory cells in the eye, all working tirelessly, transmitting information. However, of the billions of bits per second generated on the retina, only some 4 kilobytes pass through all layers of the visual cortex per second. This is the equivalent of distilling the last paragraph you're listening to right now from 400 average-length books.
So that's a lot of information to digest. I think one thing that we should talk about is that the amount of neurons does not correspond necessarily to how much information we get from things. For example, only 6 million of those cells are color cells.
I'm sorry, you said the amount of neurons. Did you mean to say the amount of cells?
Neurons are cells, but what I meant was sensory neurons.
Oh, touche. I see. Yeah. I think you make a very good point.
One way I think we could look at what sight is mathematically is looking at how we represent it on computers or in film. In film, the film that you might have grown up with if you're of a certain age, you have these little blotches on film, these little pixels, and those. And now we actually call them pixels, and they're squares, and that's what makes up visual information.
Yeah. So also, obviously, on an old sheet of film, say from an older movie like The Wizard of Oz, when you actually take a picture, it's obviously the cells on that film are sensitive to the same frequencies that our eyes are, or at least they overlap, and they're able to form a picture.
And so basically you have all these little samples that can approximate it. And what's remarkable about it, not necessarily special, but definitely remarkable, is that the more of these that you have, the better you can approximate something visually. One example that I like to think of is seeing the tip of a mountain. A mountain could really be very, very tall. It would be a really weird mountain, but really, really tall and really, really thin, and you could not see the top. But because you have so many samples coming into your eye, you can see the top. You see the highest point of most mountains.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, the sense of sight is simply remarkable. In fact, ever since I was very young, I was just I would oftentimes think about how amazing it is to be conscious of sight. That's just not something that we have the power to describe to someone. Like I've often thought, what is it like to describe seeing things just from, just subjectively, and how would you describe that to someone who, for instance, had never experienced sight? It's just phenomenal. And of course, the way I'm describing it is the experience of it versus the way Jonathan is describing it, and in terms of what actually is seen. But just the information processing is just remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have an emotional attachment, to, as most people do, to sight. My first word was actually luz, the Spanish word for light.
Oh, wow.
And one thing that I used to think about as a little kid is everybody is blind past the edge of their sight. Like, nobody can really see where their sight ends, but there is a finite field of view. So that's one of those weird things about consciousness just right off the bat that I think sight kind of tells us.
I'm actually really happy you mentioned that, Jonathan. Did you know that I actually had similar thoughts as well? In fact, I remember sitting in my station wagon, in the back seat of my station wagon with my little brother, who at the time was around 6 or so. I remember talking to my brother, and I thought, what does it look like, looking out the back of your head? Well, you don't see color and you don't see blackness. It's nothing. You just don't see. So it's kind of cool that I'm talking to you now, and you had mentioned this as well. The idea of not seeing. It's like asking, what did you experience before you were alive? Well, it wasn't blackness. It was just nothingness. It's trippy.
Yeah, I feel it has a similar quality to ask somebody, what does it feel like to fall asleep? It's a certain nobody knows, but you know what it isn't, kind of, but you don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, the whole idea of this whole story is the finiteness of sight. As amazing and as seemingly miraculous as sight is, it's measurable, and it's a limiting thing. Speaking of limiting information, as you said earlier, a lot of sight, or I'm sorry, a lot of information goes into our eye, but it doesn't all make it through the eye. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. There's a whole study of what happens to the information on the way through the cortex, and it's called Gestalt theory. Gestalt theory is all about what happens to information, what we extract from it. And one of the first, and we're not going to go over all of Gestalt because there's entire academies dedicated to Gestalt theory, but one thing that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk a few about these, is a proximity. If two objects are in close proximity, we sort of generalize them, and that's where some of the information goes. Especially if there's 2 apples on a tree, all you remember about those 2 apples is that there were 2 of them. If they look close enough, you don't have to store them separately. You can generalize.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm hearing you right. So again, this is not including paying very, very close attention, which then is going to change the information processing. But if you just look in a passing glance, it's possible that your brain will trick you into seeing the same apple duplicated. Is that right, more or less?
Well, a little bit, but even if you pay really close attention, your brain is going to take any similarities and use that to compress information.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. So we talk about information, or we talk about compression of information, which we've mentioned before. And our brain absolutely does that evolutionarily. We've learned to do that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and then what we just covered is proximity and similarity. But there's another one that is a little bit less obvious. It's called closure. So let's say I have like a bunch of leaves and they're in front of a ball. Your brain is going to complete the ball. Is going to assume that the ball is not going to assume that the ball stops or the leaf stops because it sees that those are in the foreground.
Okay. Now I'm assuming that this requires prior knowledge, of course, about balls.
Oh yeah, all of Gestalt makes assumptions.
Okay.
For example, it makes, if we see the 2 apples from one side, it assumes that they're about the same on the other side too. There's a lot of assumptions being made, but this is one that requires a lot of assumptions. If you've ever seen like a bar of soap with text carved out of it, you've experienced closure with respect to Gestalt.
You know what they say about assuming, don't you, Jonathan? And to think our brain does it all the time.
It's not very nice of it.
No. Brain shouldn't judge. But of course, we'd be, much slower at processing information if we didn't. So,
in fact, you could make the argument that it would be impossible to process any information if we made no assumptions.
Okay, so perhaps we shouldn't, tell that to, some crowd of protesters. I don't know. Anyways, I'm moving off topic here.
But so the thing about closure is that because we can make these assumptions, we don't have to store. In the example that we gave, there's proximity. There's all these leaves that are in front of this ball. Similarity, the leaves look similar, so we'd kind of clump them together. Mm-hmm. And then closure, so we have this ball behind the leaves, and then we sort of fill in the gaps with their own mind.
Okay. I'll ask you this. Obviously, when you look at that picture with the ball and the leaves in front of it, so all of that information goes into your eye, and then your brain, of course, will fill in the gaps, and based on memories, and of course, part of that is based on how information is stored and how it's compared to stuff that you already know and what you're already familiar with, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like it's like if you've ever looked through a pair of binoculars and you've seen somebody run towards you, they look like they're running in place. And it looks like that because your brain is being given a novel way of interpreting information and it doesn't know what to do with it.
Wow, so you can kind of trick your brain on that one. Fascinating. Now, one other thing I want to ask you specifically is quantitatively. Again, your eyes take in a lot of information, but not all of it makes it through it. Just in terms of bits themselves. The previous analogy we used was reducing. How many books was it?
Like 400 books to the one paragraph that you heard.
Right. So a lot of that, I don't necessarily is thrown away. Well, I guess throwing away information is probably an accurate way of explaining it, because your brain essentially, or now, is it your brain or is it your eye that makes the judgment and doesn't pass on information?
Both. Your eye gets rid of about 99.9% of it.
Oh wow! And how does that work?
That works. The way that works is it's basically bundling everything to go through the optic nerve. It finds little patterns and things, just enough in it, but it transmits just enough information for us to be able to do things like, it's remarkable how much, like, if I told you to look at a pixel on your phone, you could do that. So that's the thing that really makes this not throwing away information, is the idea of focus. So focus is what limits our amount of information, really. And if we had all the information, there's no sense at least the way that we evolved to really store all of that.
How would you capture movement? I suppose that would be capturing, or rather becoming aware of change,
Well, movement, I mean, all that is a pattern over time.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
And if you have multiple patterns over space and over time, you have the Gestalt concept of common fate. Mm-hmm. So if you see a lake, you see all this water moving towards the same place, you assume that all that water has something in common because it has a common fate.
Okay. Wow. So another really trippy concept, and this just blew my mind when I was younger, is the idea of frame rates, and the idea that the information that's coming into your eyes, it's not continuous. You do have a frame rate, isn't that right?
There isn't a frame rate like there is in cameras, for example,
or like a flip book, right? Like you don't have, like I've heard human sight as described as being approximately able to decipher roughly 24 frames per second, but that's a gross approximation in terms of how it works, right?
Yeah, it's probably, just noticing that the differences between 60 FPS and 30 FPS TV is probably close to 30 or something like that. But there is a certain maximum rate that we can notice change at. Which is a slightly different. The difference is it's like the difference between, if you've ever played with a slinky and you've moved it up and down very quickly, the bottom doesn't move that much. So it's the difference between that and blinking your eyes and looking at your hand moving up and down and opening your eyes every single time is in the same place. So that's the frame rate versus.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgranger.com or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
The way that we sort of interpret vision. So we do it kind of continuously, but there is a sort of maximum virtual frame rate. So yes and no.
Wow. Again, this is all comes down to this whole philosophical idea that there are things that can be in front of you that you can't see. It's an interesting reality of the world that we live in.
Then, and of course, you have these aggregate senses that come from sight. For example, one that I like to talk about is expression. If you look at all the dimensions in expression, there's basically one dimension for every muscle in the face. So, like, for example, if I smile, there's so many different expressions I could communicate with different types of smiles. I could be somebody who's trying to get something over on somebody. I can be genuine. I can be mischievous. There's so many, and all of these things are a very high-dimensional derived sense, and we'll get to derived senses a little bit later too.
One other thing that I want to go ahead and point out here is we talk about vision, and we talk about the spectrum that we see, and which is approximately between 400 and 700 nanometers. However, there are other animals and there are other creatures in the animal kingdom that see very differently than us. Jonathan, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Bees, for example, see flowers much more differently than we do. They see them with like a target shape, because it's a very simple shape for bees to see amongst all the complexity of the shape of a flower. And it's designed to see that because it's advantageous for the bee to do that, because the bee gets pollen and then the flower gets pollinated.
Oh, it's fascinating. Now, I'm sorry, I was aware that bees can see a different spectrum than we can see. If I'm not mistaken, they can see into the ultraviolet spectrum. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they can see ultraviolet.
Okay.
Then you have snakes, for example, who could see infrared.
Oh, wow.
So they could see mice and things like that in what we call the dark. Everything glows to them.
Okay. Now, of course, we've expanded our own site somewhat through applications like military night vision goggles and things like that, which work kind of similarly, I think, but not quite the same.
You can see, if you want right now, you can see a color that does not exist. And I'm not just talking about yellow or purple, which don't exist. Mm-hmm. And for the reason why yellow doesn't exist is because yellow is just a combination of yellow and red. So most yellow...
I'm sorry, say that again. Yellow?
Yellow is just mostly a combination of red and green.
Okay.
Sorry. So a lot of yellow isn't actual pure yellow. So yellow a lot of times is fake.
It's worth pointing out. I'm so sorry. It's worth pointing out that when you combine light, that when you combine a color of light, it's different than when you combine paint colors.
It's called additive versus subtractive color, and you could check that out on other things. It's a very interesting topic that we unfortunately don't have time to go into.
Yeah, that's correct.
But basically, every time you see yellow on TV, it's not real yellow. Then you have purple, which never existed, because purple is not an actual hue, because purple is a combination of red and blue. It's different than violet. And so that's a color that doesn't exist at all. But if you want to see a color that extremely doesn't exist, just get a red sheet of paper and a blue sheet of paper, put one in front of each eye, and you'll see this weird shimmery reddish blue that does not exist, but it's a completely new color.
Oh wow, I want to see that now. Wow, that's insane. So how is it a new color, but purple is not a new color?
Well, it's just as purple. It's just as colory as. I mean, most people would say that purple's a color, so I'm using colloquial versus like scientific. This is where we're getting into some confusing terminology.
Okay. Wow. That's fascinating.
For you, the listeners of Breaking Math Podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day free trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. My recommendation for today is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, written by Robert A. Heinlein. It's an awesome book. It's a science fiction novel about a revolt from the moon colony against the Earth, where the moon is a penal colony. It has to do a lot with artificial intelligence. There's some light transhuman themes. It's very interesting.
And for me, my story that I'd like to recommend for Audible is called A Quantum Story by Jim Baggett. A quantum story is a review of what we know about modern physics, that is to say, quantum mechanics, and it goes from the very dawn of quantum mechanics with Max Planck and the Planck length, all the way through things like quantum loop gravity and ideas in string theory. It's a fascinating read, and it's a great big, thick read. But having it read to you on Audible would be a very nice and a very enriching experience, don't you think, Jonathan?
Oh yeah, definitely. I have a lot of notes on this book.
Quick story. I actually gave it to Jonathan, and I called it the steak challenge to finish it because it's a very, very thick book, but it's a great book.
And so to download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/breakingmath. Again, that's audibletrial.com/breakingmath for your free audiobook. And now, back to the show. Sound is similar to sight in many ways. It responds to frequency information. It gives us information about the shapes of the world around us and is used, arguably a lot in humans, for interspecies communication. Yet there is something fundamentally different about sound. Sound is, if you include time, two-dimensional, while sight is a three-dimensional sheet traveling through 6 dimensions. So what does this fundamental distinction, if anything, mean? So what's the fundamental unit of sound, and why is it appropriate that we're talking about sound?
So for sound, of course, the fundamental unit I would say would be frequency or pitch, as it's oftenly referred to.
Yeah, and I was thinking we should have started with sound because we're on a podcast, but I think that one of the reasons why we didn't is because our primary human sense is vision, but here we are talking about sound.
Yeah. So, and again, you said a lot of interesting points there. I like how we specifically are going to contrast the information that we get from sound with the information that we get from sight. And again, once again, we are describing the mathematics of sound and fundamentally how we get information from sound. So obviously, frequency is the amount of wavelengths per unit of time, and that has a lot to do with what we hear. Now, we hear a spectrum of sound, and there's a lot of animals that they can hear things outside of our spectrum of sound.
Yeah, our spectrum goes from about 20 vibrations per second to 20,000 vibrations per second. Yeah. Actually, we can hear sound through our bones if we're underwater. Interesting fact.
Wow, that is fascinating. So now, when we talk about sight and sound and how that interacts specifically with the nervous system, it's going to be a little different, So in sound, we've got a set of bones in both ears that essentially vibrates during when it comes into contact with vibrating air molecules, right? And that's why we hear sound differently at different elevations where the air is thicker or thinner.
Well, yeah, and not only that, you have all these little you have basically, it's like a little spiral, and the spiral, every time that the air compresses, the spiral compresses and decompresses, and then you have these little hairs on the spiral that literally vibrate at the frequency that you're hearing them at. So the stuff that gets directly input into your brain is not the pressure of the space around you, but rather a processed version of it, the frequency.
Wow, that's fascinating. I actually had no idea about that.
Yeah, and these things are not, you could say that they are nerves, so you could say that they are part of that, but see, this is where we get into what is a processed sense and what is a direct sense. There's no clear line.
Interesting. Now, you said something earlier, and I'm actually very curious about this. You said that sound is two-dimensional. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So at any given time, you hear a bunch of pitches. So you can hear a chord like this one right here. Or you could hear two people talking, like me and Gabriel counting to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We kind of almost harmonized there, but then I think you got off there, Jonathan.
And so that's why we have different pitches that you hear at any given time. So that's like you can think of those pitches being in a column. So when you hear, or like on a piano roll is a two-dimensional sheet of paper, and you could hear, if you had a piano with enough keys, you could play any sound.
Okay, I get it. So again, I'm thinking about the two-dimensional aspect of it. I know that one way of differentiating sound is pitch, and then what's the other?
Volume. So for example, so that's another aspect of it. So any sound can really be represented as a black and white picture.
Interesting. Okay, so obviously, I don't know, and I'm curious. Evolutionary speaking, what probably came first, sight or sound? And I'm not really sure on that one, actually.
You know what? I think that that's difficult to because with sight you have to have stuff that corresponds to photons, but with I mean, all hearing is a very gussied up version of touch.
You know what? Actually, I think it's a really good way of putting it. And we talked about the hardware of sound, about I believe the bone is called the cochlear part of the ear. We didn't even talk at all about the nervous system aspect of sound, because our brain certainly processes sound as well.
Oh yeah, and much less is known about the nervous system of sound, but we do know about what happens because of it. Most of the nervous system of sound gets processed as language and things like that.
It's fascinating. Actually, just last week, I was even thinking that, in my mind, I can hear my wife's voice, and it's fascinating that memory can be stored that way because, obviously I don't hear anything, like there's no sound, yet I still have that memory. I think that's fascinating. In fact, I can even have an internal monologue, and it's not in any voice whatsoever, yet I am clearly, or to myself, I absolutely am having that monologue, but I don't have any way of explaining it because it's not a sound, but it certainly is happening. I just find that fascinating.
It's sort of a sense of language, and the sense of language comes out when you think about the cocktail party effect. And what that is it's basically I'm going to say some words and Gabriel's going to say some words, and you try to pick out some words that he's saying and some words that I'm saying.
There's also a whole lot of things that I like to talk about.
The first
here.
type of metal is copper.
People watching is a lot
Copper
of fun.
is
you can look
a
around and be like, okay,
disgusting
so
metal.
who's engaged in this conversation?
So yeah, if you listen to that craziness, that's the cocktail party effect. And the cocktail party effect really is more about hearing your own name, but it's related to this effect.
Oh, that's fascinating. So when you hear your own name, obviously that has less to do with the sense of sound, and rather that's the processing of sound. Because something familiar, I heard that, right?
Yeah, and when you're hearing me and Gabriel speaking at the same time, you know my voice, and you know Gabriel's voice, and you know two voices sound like at the same time. So you were able to pick our voices apart using transforms.
Wow.
I believe that this is actually processed in the anterior olive, which is a part of the brain that has to do with synchronizing things, and that's binaural beats. Binaural beats have a lot of properties that may or may not exist. For example, helping with studying. There's a lot of woo surrounding it.
Wow, I've never actually. This is the first time I've heard of binaural beats.
What it is you have let's say 400 hertz in one ear and just a little bit more than 400 in the other ear. What you'll hear is a sort of beat frequency between them.
Okay, I've heard that now. When my wife and I were part of Rumble, actually the local improv choir group, when everyone would sing together, we would hear beats. Is that the same thing?
Those are just that's just the beat frequency. These are binaural beats that are created only in the brain.
Oh, okay.
So in your left ear you hear one frequency, in your right ear you hear the other frequency, but together you hear a sort of binaural beat. And we'll play an example of that right now. And so yeah, those were binaural beats.
Interesting.
And that's one illusion that you do with sound. And why do you think? So why do you suppose it's important that we keep talking about illusion with every sense?
Oh, right, yeah, because we talk about optical illusions, or I'm sorry, not just optical, but information illusions in general, because the brain takes in information and sometimes it makes up information.
And that making up information is an essential part of consciousness. We'll go more into that thesis in the second episode. And so, for example, you might think something might be impossible to hear, like a tone that is constantly rising or falling. But when such tone exists, it's called a shepherd tone, and we'll play a little bit of that right now.
Oh, this is a fascinating one. It's one of my favorite ones. So how about we just play it until it reaches its peak, huh?
So as you could probably guess, it has no end.
Yes. Oh, I love that tone. I love it.
And there's actually a really simple reason why the shepherd tone can exist. And let's see if you can get it.
We're not going to tell you.
But I'll tell you that it's related to the appearance of if you've ever seen like a twisted object rotating like a barber's pole. It's related to that.
The smell of rain, the smell of beer, the smell of dirt, the smell of blood, the smell of cooking. You had a memory associated with everything we just mentioned. Why is that? Part of it is physiological. Our hippocampus, responsible for helping form memories, is almost directly connected to the part of the body responsible for sensing aromatic, usually volatile chemicals.
So yeah, as Gabriel mentioned, there's a almost direct link between memory and smell. Andy Warhol used to use it actually for indexing his life. He would have a different aroma associated with every year of his life. He would wear that aroma for that year and then move on.
I had no idea. That is fascinating. Is there any record of what effect that actually had on his recollection?
I'm not sure if there was Andy Warhol. I almost called him Andy Weirdhol. But yeah, he was a weird guy. And one thing that we're going to talk a little bit on this episode, but we decided not to for brevity, was good versus bad versions of the sense.
Oh no, it's a very relevant topic because obviously, yeah, there are aromas that are pleasing and aromas that are the term I'll use is putrid, or disgusting aromas.
And then and then to show you the nature of aroma and how it differs from the other senses, there are illusory aromas. For example, think of the smell of vomit. Now think of the smell of Parmesan cheese. They're the exact same volatile chemical. It's been proven.
Oh my gosh!
Or at
wow.
least demonstrated.
Yeah, that's amazing. So there's more to it than simply in other words, this is to show that there is no such thing as a good smell or a bad smell. It's based on what it's relative to.
Yeah, and so, I mean, if you have a good memory of eating some Parmesan cheese on some pasta versus having, I don't think anybody has a pleasant memory associated with vomit.
And actually, I'm curious here because now I know that things like rotten eggs and sulfur, in my opinion, are pretty putrid, are pretty nasty. That and other hideous smells as well. One could name a number of things. So I don't know that. I think some things may be more hard coded to be volatile. Isn't that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, just like there are certain tones, like babies crying, that are always going to sound like always going to evoke certain like emotions, like wanting to get rid of the crying.
Yeah, interesting. So then, in a way, I may have to contradict myself there for a bit. So obviously, in the vomit versus Parmesan cheese example, that shows two of the same smells that can either be good or bad. But then, other smells, like I think there are some horrible smells that I've smelled in my day in the medical field when I was an EMT, and elsewhere that are certainly bad. That are probably pretty hard coded.
It's interesting that most people, like, there's something about the vomit versus Parmesan cheese thing that is so, one is excretory, the other one is the opposite of excretory. It's a really interesting thing that shows the type of sense that scent is.
Interesting. So I have a question about this sense of smell. Now, this is one that I know almost the least about. So I know that there are ways of describing things like what we feel, like if something is sharp or soft or or rough. Are there categories? Are there fundamental categories of smell? Like there are, like there's primary colors. Are there primary smells?
There's not primary smells, but there are categories of smell, and they're not in typical parlance, which is also something that's different about them. We have a few written down here. There's citrusy smells. Everybody knows what that is. Floral, herbaceous, camphoraceous, woody, earthy, which includes some very terrible smells. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways of categorizing them, but there's no primary colors of smells. There's no way of taking a smell and then making it using other smells in ways that don't take human intuition.
Interesting. So I'm curious then, who created these categories of smell? Like, is it just tradition, or is this, has this been identified by people studying senses?
Oh, I think it's a long tradition that has to do with perfumery. Perfumery used to be a big thing. Smell is probably one of the things that we have the least grasp on.
Yes.
I mean, we came up with photography first, then we came out with record players. We're just now getting to tricking the sense of human touch with those buttons that aren't really buttons that you have on phones now.
Oh, okay, I see. Oh, so are you saying, Jonathan, that we are on our way toward smell-o-vision?
Smell-o-vision coming in 2030.
I'm not necessarily sure that would be a good thing.
And one interesting thing about scent is how incredibly, even in humans who don't have good scent, or a good sense of smell, rather, or a good scent, is how good it is. There's this one monk who was trying to see how big atoms were. So using burning incense, he waited until he could give the tiniest whiff of incense. And he was only off by a few orders of magnitude as to what the size of an atom was.
Oh, wow, I had no idea. When did that happen?
It was actually in the Dark Ages.
Oh, fascinating. Just from incense. That's actually fascinating. You know what I wonder? I wonder if, evolutionary speaking, if smell may have evolved before sight. This is me just taking a stab at the dark. I really have no idea. If one of our listeners can correct me, you should write to me at breakingmathpodcast@gmail.com. But I was thinking that maybe the relation between memory and smell is because smell is much older, perhaps?
That might be the case, but also it might be the case that smell is just smell, if you really think about it, is just a much more fancy version of taste.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the sense that they're both ways of detecting types of chemicals. And so, I mean, does a paramecium smell something when they detect something in the area, or like at what point do you call it smell? Does it have to be in the air? Does it
Good question.
There's so many questions about this. And the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is just a sense that I haven't really seen described in many places, but a sense that I think is definitely a derived sense, in the same way that proprioception is a sense. Proprioception being the sense of where you are, which is an example of a sense that is one point in space, but in dozens of dimensions. Basically, every joint is another dimension. Is a sense of creature. When you look at a rabbit, you could tell it's alive, versus a rock, and the rock looks dead.
Now, of course, there are some fish that look an awful lot like rocks.
Yeah, but then they move and then they seem alive.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then you have trees, which only seem alive because we see contrast between big and small trees.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, yeah, I gotta say, Jonathan, you are actually the first person who's ever brought this up. I'm wondering if this is something that you have come up with, or have you read about this anywhere?
I'm sure I haven't come up with it, but I'm sure that somebody else has also come up with it, but I know I haven't read it anywhere.
Yeah. I want to hear a little bit more about your idea here.
Oh yeah, I do have an idea of how sense of creature is related or is advantageous evolutionarily, and that's in the sense of cuteness, basically, what we decide to take care of.
Interesting. Yeah, cuteness is a fascinating thing. Oh, this is something that I feel so ill-equipped to describe. I mean, we can identify when something is cute, but why is there cuteness? What role does that have in evolution?
Yeah, and also, I mean, people keep rabbits as pets, but most of the animals that we keep are predators. We somehow think that predators are cute, and when they do predatory behavior, like practice stalking, that's when we take care of them the most. So there's something about that, and it's a very interesting and very complicated, developed and meta-sensory sense. And I only bring this up to show something that's like the boundary of what a sense is and what just being learned is, because in humans binocular vision is learned, for example.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Now, actually, I want to talk about something that Jonathan and I were talking about before this episode started, and that was when things are really, really cute, like babies or animals, you have this desire to either pull on them or to eat them up. I've heard a parent say to a child, "Oh, I'm just going to eat you up," and then teasingly pretend to take a bite out of their child, but all clearly ingest. And why are those two related? That's a really fascinating question.
Yeah, I've heard some theories that say that it's basically our sense of competition with another predatory species, but that's being stopped by our sense of cuteness, but we still have the residual desire to squeeze something to death or to bite it to death. We're a violent species.
Yeah, we are certainly a mysterious species, that's for sure. That's for sure.
But one thing that seems alive, and some people think that our concept of a soul in a lot of religions may have taken form from this, is fire and smoke, which are highly dynamic systems and seem to be alive, and that's an example of a creature sense illusion.
Interesting. This is something I've never even thought of before. The idea of fire being alive. Now that I'm thinking about it, you think of any of the ways you can characterize life. I don't know. It's something that can grow, that eats. All of these are things that you can use to describe fire. It can be predatory, obviously, and it can die out when it runs out of oxygen. Wow, you're tripping me out here, Jonathan. When you think about is fire alive? I want you to. How would you answer that question?
I'd say that one of the things that makes it maybe not as alive is that it doesn't really combine traits or evolve very much. Although you could say that it evolves as it goes from you start burning copper and you get a green flame. I mean, it's one of those things where you can even view life itself as a type of fire. Interesting.
Now, one of the things I think of is just purely from information. So obviously fire is a way of quickly creating disinformation. So could it be that other forms of life maybe first organize information before disorganizing it?
That could be. I mean, I do feel like treating fire as being alive is somehow getting into Aristotelian theory, but it is a question that I would like you to think about.
There's a terminology here that I'd like to introduce, and this is actually very, very much related to senses as well as, one's subjective view of the world. The term is Umwelt, and that is a term that is used to describe the world as someone knows it, which for us as a human species is based on what we are used to, based on what we've seen and what we've experienced, but it's not necessarily the world as it really, really is. Would you say that's a pretty good description of Umwelt?
I mean, yeah, I think that it's kind of assumes that there is a world as it really exists in a certain sense, but I think that's a good definition as any.
Is it possible to change one's umwelt? That is to say, is it possible to expand upon the senses that we as a species have and experience the world differently through our senses? And the answer that I have is I think so. There's actually a researcher, and his name is Dr. David Eagleman, and he's made many publications. He's appeared on TED Talks. He's been written about in a lot of journals, and he is trying to do just that. He has this device that he is creating, and it is called a versatile extrasensory transducer, or the acronym VEST. And it is exactly that. It is a vest that you wear, and it has very, very small motors all throughout it. And the motors can change both their pitch. Actually, I think the motors can only change their pitch, but it's different motors with different pitches. So you have a few, degrees of freedom there. The idea with a vibrating vest, why would he want to create a vibrating vest? Well, you can actually link up the vibrating vest to a number of things, including, for instance, a drone. And you can have it so that the altitude of the drone, or perhaps the yaw of the drone, or the position, or rather, will correspond to a vibration somewhere on the vest of some strength and of some pitch. That way, if you're a pilot and if you're controlling this drone, after you learn the language of the vibrations, you can feel, quote unquote, you can sort of feel the exact position of it while it's flying in space. Is that a good way of explaining it?
Yeah, I would compare it a lot to those colorblind glasses that have come out recently, that you put them on and they accentuate the amount of difference between the cones that are very close together, or even to reading systems for blind people that use electrodes on the tongue.
Interesting, yeah. So now, arguably, I would not say, for instance, that he is creating a whole new sense altogether at all, in fact, because clearly all he's using is the sense of touch, which already exists. But the fact that he's mapping, specific frequencies and specific places to something else, like in this case, position of a drone that's flying around and altitude, that is still a very, very useful thing that hasn't been done before.
Yeah, and you really could say that he's creating a new derived sense, however.
Okay.
Because, I mean, even humans, like we mentioned before, are not born with a sense of binocular vision.
Interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating that binocular vision is, in fact, a learned trait. That just blows my mind.
And you can do things like install electrodes in the brains of monkeys that allow them to control arms that allow them to grab fruit.
This is fascinating. I didn't believe this when I first read this. So essentially, what we're saying is you just install this arm, and it's installed through the spine. Is that correct?
Somewhere. I don't remember if it's the spine or a part of the brain.
Okay. So when I heard this, I at first didn't believe it. And I'm going to tell you why it was very hard for me to believe. I guess I assumed somewhere that inside of a monkey brain or inside of our brain, there's probably already a map that exists of the body that it's in. And I thought, well, if you add, a mechanical limb, there's no map for that mechanical limb. It doesn't exist. Like so it wouldn't be compatible. But that's not the case.
And of course, you need a certain complexity of nervous system to do this. You couldn't do this with the nematode, for example.
Okay.
There are certain nematodes that only have like the exact same amount of neurons per nematode.
Interesting. So what we're saying then is that the brain and the nervous system essentially have a great ability to learn and to adapt.
Yes, and that is where consciousness, if it has a source, can be said to come from. The world is a complex place with intermingling ecosystems that have developed life that has evolved to react in turn, and we are no exception. But what happens when these senses are processed in a way that could be seen as inharmonious with their niche? Stay tuned for Consciousness, Episode 2. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Gabriel.
And this has been Breaking Math. Breaking Math is brought to you by Audible, and we are part of Blank for Non-Blank. Any last words?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, we had actually did a mini-sode on Blank for Non-Blank. It's a phenomenal collective. Essentially, it's a whole lot of podcasters who want to bring a subject matter to the masses. And of course, there's Let's Talk, which is the one of the two linguistics podcasts. There's what's the other linguistics one?
There's Words for Granted, and there's Mad Scientist Podcast, Folktale Project, and a few others.
Go check it out.
Yeah, go check it out. And if you would like to support us, for as little as the price of a sandwich, you can get advanced content. And actually, we are going to be lowering our price for advanced content and for a shout out to $1. So if you take advantage of that now, even before we put up the changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And until next time, go send some stuff.